social research organisation, and you have the documentary filmmaker John Grierson, who used to work for the Empire Marketing Board before it was closed down in 1933, and then went to the General Post Office, where he organised a whole series of documentaries about social conditions. Probably two of the most famous are Coalface and Housing Problems, that came out in 1934 and 1935. Okay, so chronologically, this all happens in the second half of the 1930s. Arguably, when actually economic and social conditions were improving. Okay, so it's not this discovery of poverty, this rediscovery of poverty, yet again happens at the point when things are beginning to turn around in some communities. Last point is, as I said, what they wanted to do was document the conditions so that other people would be aware of them. And this, they felt, was addressing the important democratic deficit. We have a democracy, and yet well-informed citizens like us are unaware of the conditions that most people live in. And you can't have a fully functioning democracy in an environment where the media basically don't cover the main story. So let me play you this, and then we'll talk about Orwell, Priestley, and all the folks you're about to hear about.
On October the 24th, 1929, the breaking point came. That day saw the Wall Street crash. Within a year, the crisis had spread to nearly every country. Many branches of industry stopped work. The economic crisis held Britain in its grip. The gate shut behind 3 million workers.
In the 1930s, as the social consequences of the Depression began to be felt, particularly in the traditional heartlands of industry, the Clyde Valley, South Wales and the north of England, a generation of journalists, writers, photographers and filmmakers set out to document what they believed to be the facts about life in industrial Britain. This documentary movement was predominantly middle class, and in a country of deep social divisions, making contact with the working class was no easy task. Travelling the country in search of the facts was the hallmark of the documentary movement.
The shock, really, of the Depression was a realization that there was a kind of alien tribe in the Midlands and the northern industrial parts of England living quite different lives from the bourgeois, genteel south. And so there is this kind of extraordinary exodus, really, to go and find out what was happening, what was hunger like, where it really hurt. It was almost like anthropologists going to darkest Africa to report back on this strange alien tribe.
One of the first reports was J.B. Priestley's English Journey, published in 1934. I remembered then how, just after the armistice, I'd been sent to look after some German prisoners of war. They'd a certain look, these prisoners of war. It was a strange, greyish, faintly decomposed look. I did not expect to see that kind of face again for a long time, but I was wrong. I'd seen a lot of those faces on this journey. They belonged to unemployed men. J.B. Priestley was acknowledged by the photographer Bill Brandt as an important influence on his first book, The English at Home, published in 1936. Mr. Brandt shows himself to be not only an artist, but an anthropologist. He seems to have wandered about England with the detached curiosity of a man investigating the customs of some remote and unfamiliar tribe.
Brandt's The English at Home was based upon a particular genre of German photo book. That's to say, it was the idea of a cross-section that you could take a city, a day in the life, or even perhaps a whole culture like England, and literally cross-section it. Now that sounds very modern, but what you cut through and reveal is in fact Victorian and Edwardian in its shape.
Workers did not much appreciate social investigators, as John Jones, a Welsh miner, told the writer James Hanley. The men down here, in fact all the people down here, have grown very, very sensitive about the enormous number of people who come down from London and Oxford and Cambridge, making inquiries, inspecting places, descending underground, questioning women about their cooking, asking questions about this, that and the other. That's all. They're not animals in a zoo, that's what it is. The best-known documentary journey is George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, published in 1937. While the cold indignation at conditions in the industrial north make the book a classic of reportage, the attitudes of its author reveal a crucial limitation of the documentary movement. Orwell could not, or would not, put aside his own class perspective.
Orwell continually is focusing on the smell of the working class, the otherness, how they are so very different. That image, that image of his abhorrence, completely overrode any sort of sense of this as a social documentary, and made me realise just how far people like Orwell were from actually bridging that gulf.
You all right for sound?
The filmmaker John Grierson, who was alert to the dangers social divisions pose for a mass democracy, saw film as the medium best suited to informing and involving citizens in the workings of their society. For funding, Grierson turned to the state, first to the Empire Marketing Board, then, famously, to the Post Office.
Here's the show copy. Right, strike 'em up.
Soviet cinema shaped the work of the GPO film unit, but the heroics had to be scaled down. In Russia, the giants of Soviet labour. In England, the postman.
The influence of Soviet montage cinema on the documentary filmmakers was immense. They liked the way that the Soviet films had placed the worker as hero. They liked the way that the Soviet films had gone outdoors, gone on location. But perhaps most importantly, they were very, very influenced by Eisenstein's theories of montage. But whereas Eisenstein saw montage as a formal filmic expression of the revolutionary conflict in Russia, Grierson used montage to present the working man integrated into the wider social sphere. So in, for instance, the last sequence of Drifters, the labour of the fishermen is integrated through the distribution of the herring catch, and it's about social unity rather than conflict.
This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order.
And social unity is the hidden message of Night Mail, perhaps the best known British film of the 30s.
Night Mail's very important for film because in a period when many people, particularly intellectuals, felt that Britain was falling apart, that the north of unemployment and heavy industry and the south of light industry and relative affluence were becoming two different countries, Night Mail dramatically unified in its very structure the south, where the film starts, the north of England, through which it passes, full of scenes of high drama, of the great factories throbbing away.
The mines of Wigan.
And then on to Scotland, which is drawn together as part of the same country.
All Scotland waits for her. In the dark glens, beside the pale green sea lochs, Men long for news.
Letters of thanks, letters from banks, letters of joy from the girl and the boy, receipted bills and invitations to inspect new stock or visit relations and applications for situations and timid lovers, declarations and gossip from all the nations, news circumstantial, news financial, letters with holiday snaps to enlarge in, letters with faces scrawled in the margin, letters from uncles, cousins and aunts, letters to Scotland from the south of France, letters of condolence to Highlands and Lowlands, notes from overseas to Hebrides, written on paper of every hue, the pink, the violet, the white and the blue, the chatty, the catty, the boring, adoring, the cold and official, all the hearts outpouring, clever, stupid, short and long, the type and the printing and spelled all wrong.
At the end of the film we have Auden's famous poetic script saying, "And who can bear to think themselves forgotten?" Well, in this film the North and Scotland were very much remembered and made to seem part of the great endeavour of the great British National Post Office.
Grierson and his school of filmmakers brought the reality of work to the screen for the first time. But their enthusiasm for the techniques of Soviet cinema meant that workers tended to be portrayed as abstract embodiments of the dignity of labour, rather than as individuals. They also tended to be men.
Interestingly, it was a woman, Storm Jameson, a northern woman from Whitby, from Leeds University, who voiced, I suppose, a fairly common feeling among proletarian people, that it was time, especially for these male southern bourgeois onlookers, to shed their feeling of kind of personal horror and stop holding their noses, and to really sort of get inside the reality of proletarian life.
Set up in 1937 by a poet and journalist, Charles Madge, and an anthropologist, Tom Harrison, Mass Observation was the documentary movement's most ambitious project. Its attempt to study the everyday aspects of people's lives went some way to answering Storm Jameson's criticisms. Mass Observation began by recruiting a nationwide network of volunteer observers, each filing a monthly account of their daily routine.
I'm a lorry driver, just under 30, married, we have 2 children. My first introduction to mass observation came through a newspaper article in which a miner gave an account of a day's work. How interesting. To think our up-shoulders played darts, swapped stories with miners, yet knew so little of how they lived. So I joined mass observation because I was glad to tell how we really live and not how some misguided people imagine we do.
But Mass Observation could not resist the by now obligatory journey north. Tom Harrison, fresh from a census of the great crested grebe and anthropological studies on the island of Malekula, together with his team of observers, set up camp in Bolton, called Worktown for the purposes of the study, and began to observe the natives.
Tom Harrison had persuaded me that by gathering information about people, we were going to be able to improve the world for those people. And so, in a rather fuzzy kind of way, I thought that by doing this job, we were going to make the world a better place.
Humphrey Spender used new, lightweight German 35mm cameras like the Contax and the Leica for his mass observations.
I found it alarming in the sense that of being a foreigner there, and slightly embarrassing. If I was seen to be coming into a pub, I was immediately recognized as a foreigner and everything would stop. All that side of it I found difficult. The whole object of mass observation was to find things out about human behavior rather than to pressurize people into doing what the photographer wanted.
Humphrey Spender went on to work for Picture Post, the photo magazine launched in 1938, which popularized many of the concerns of the documentary movement. But Tom Harrison also recruited painters, and their experience highlighted the difficulties involved in achieving an objective stance.